Okay, thank you all for joining. My name is Mark James. I'm the ESET UK IT security specialist. Anybody that's seen my webinars before will know that I prefer to do webinars about our products so that you can actually see the product, see how it works, see the configuration as such. Webinars on presentations I try wherever possible not to do, only because I find it quite difficult to stay focused, to not fall asleep. I appreciate my Hampshire accent is one of those that can send you off and into the drowsy world. But hopefully this one won't do that today. There'll be plenty of information, like I say. And if you do end up either being removed from the webinar or can't view it for any reason, then like I say, you can always email me to get a copy of the recording. GDPR, very interesting. It's something that is going to affect pretty well each and every business as of next year. And it's something that everybody are going to need to be aware of to see how it affects them. And you know, there's varying parts of the GDPR that may or may not affect you, but there is an awful lot that's changing, and there's an awful lot that you need to be aware of. So like I say, I'm going to go through the webinar. I've got a fair few slides here to go through. There will be an option for some questions at the end, but I've done this webinar previously, and asking for questions, nobody had questions. So I think it's a case of having a look at it, digesting it, seeing how it affects you, and then just following the general trend of the GDPR to see, you know, how it can affect your business or your customers' businesses. Okay, so first thing, there are some terms which are used throughout the white paper and throughout this webinar. I've tried where possible in this webinar to pull information from the white paper, and anybody who looks at the white paper afterwards maybe think to themselves, well, you know, that's very similar. It looks like you've just sort of created the webinar out of the white paper, and to be honest, that's exactly what I've done. Mainly so that, you know, at a later date, with a copy of the webinar and a copy of the white paper, maybe, you know, between the two, things might start making sense if they don't already make sense, or, you know, might come together a little bit more, you know, maybe than they would if I just tried to come up with a flowery webinar, you know, just talking about it. And the problem is GDPR is very factual, and it's something that you really need to be absolutely sure on how it does and doesn't affect you. But some of the things that you need to be aware of, we're going to see terms like data subject, data processor, and data controller. Data subject is a natural person whose personal data is processed by a controller or a processor. For the sake of clarity, we will refer to these as customers or employees. A data processor is the entity that processes data on behalf of the data controller, and we'll refer to these as the processing company. And a data controller is an entity that determines the purposes, conditions, and means of processing the personal data. And again, we'll refer to these as the controlling company or company in control. It's a great start to try and get these sort of processes out of the way, but you do need to be aware of them. Excuse me. You do need to be aware of them throughout the webinar. Okay, so just a few key facts. Okay, the GDPR will, and I mean will, apply in the UK from the 25th of May 2018. The government has confirmed that the UK's decision to leave the EU will not affect the commencement of the GDPR, and we will find out why shortly. The GDPR applies to controllers and processors of data, and it's one of those things to say, you know, up until now, it's just been, you know, certain types, whereas now it is actually going to affect both controllers and processors. But more importantly, the GDPR applies to processing carried out by organizations operating within the EU. It also applies to organizations outside the EU that offers goods or services, free or paid for, to individuals in the EU. So that's why it is going to affect potentially, you know, anybody and everybody. So some of the significant changes: expanded territorial scope, so including EU as well as non-EU countries. Higher fines and a broader range of powers for national data protection authorities. Fines is an interesting one. At the moment, the ICU can fine up to 500,000 for each incident of data breach where you can prove to be negligent or you haven't done what you could have done or should have done to protect that data. And I often get asked, comment for, for the type of things that I do, and people say, is £500,000 enough? Is it enough of a deterrent, for a large organisation? I appreciate for a smaller business, fines leading up to £500,000 is an awful lot of money. 10, 15, £20,000 fine for a small business, it's pretty bad. And to be honest, could be in economic standards and times, it could be catastrophic. But when you look at things like £500,000 or £400,000 for people like TalkTalk, whilst they're a very large business, very large organisation, is that fine relevant? Does that carry enough clout as a fine? And the thing is, we need to understand these days, it's not necessarily about the fine. Yes, the fine is an element of what's gone wrong, but quite often the fine just goes along with the PR backlash, the mistrust, the lack of confidence in that company that they can protect that data. And it's those things, which carry, sort of issues along with the fine. But certainly, as you'll see a little bit later, these fines have been massively increased, which I personally think is a good thing. I think I'm sure there have been instances where the security of data has been sort of tallied up against how much it costs now to secure that data, and realistically how much it would cost if there was a data breach and we were fined by an organisation. And sadly, if the latter one is less, then maybe, I don't know, I'm not directly in control or anything to do with companies, but maybe somebody has made that decision to say, look, let's just wait and see what happens, and if so, we'll pay the fine. But anyway, stricter rules for acquiring and retracting an individual's consent. Almost certainly now, pretty well everything you do on the internet in one way or another, relies on you giving over some kind of private data. And nearly always there's a tick box that says, I consent for you to do this with my data. And sort of up until now, up until the GDPR, it's always been a case of, it's quite simple. You either tick the box and we move forward, or you don't tick the box and we don't move forward. So there are certainly some different rules and regulations coming in regarding consent. Stricter breach notification rules, ensuring that when breaches happen, certain things, certain criteria are met, certain things happen, and businesses do everything they possibly can as quickly as possible so that the breach, also that the public are made aware. Certainly, GDPR and relative NDPA are informed. The GDPR also expands the rights of individuals, so it's not necessarily just about businesses. It expands the rights of individuals to have things like the right to objective profiling. So profiling is where obviously data is kept and looked at, and we try and build up a profile of maybe your shopping habits or your browsing habits or any other type of habit. We profile the data we've got or they've got, and try and come up and understand you as a person based on your profile. And you have a right to object to that. You also have a right to obtain a copy of any gathered personal data. So at any given time you can say, I would like you to tell me or show me exactly what data you have on me on your records. And gone are the days where it can just be lost by an email and nothing gets done about it, and it just gets forgotten, and there's nobody to back it up, and it doesn't go anywhere. Now there are going to be strict guidelines and rules to say that you must reply to these within a reasonable amount of time, and you must provide that data if the customer asks for it. And also the right to be forgotten. If it can, if you can put up a valid case to say that the data that you originally asked me for is not relevant or pertinent anymore to the business you're doing, so therefore I want that data to be removed. All of these things, the GDPR is not just about the business, now it's trying to protect, the user themselves. So one of the big questions, will it affect me? It's very easy, I think, at the moment when people look at things like the ICO and data breaches, and I often stand up in front of people and I talk to people about encryption and those sort of things, and people say to me, well, it doesn't really affect me. I don't carry USBs. I don't send data out anywhere. I don't have anything pertinent on my laptop or anything. And the thing is, an awful lot of the time, the ICO affects people, or data breaches will affect people, whether you actually realize it or not. And the GDPR is very similar. So any company or a company is subject to the GDPR if it either offers goods or services to data subjects in the EU, irrespective of whether payment is received. So whether it's a free service or a paid service, then it will affect you if you do that. Goods or services. Or monitor data subjects' behavior within the EU. So if you monitor any type of data, behavior or otherwise within the EU, then you are subject to the GDPR, which realistically is going to cover most companies. Most companies will have data on record of either their employees or their customers or both, and you need to ensure that all relative measures are taken to protect that data. So as I said, certainly an increase in fines. Up until now, like I say, £500,000 for each incident as far as the ICO is concerned. Penalties are now to be divided into two groups. They may sound similar, but they are divided into two groups. So firstly, up to 2% of your annual worldwide turnover of the preceding financial year, or 10 million euros, whichever is the greater. Now this is serious money. This is the sort of money, no matter what size of the business. And for me, it's one of those things that if you're making a lot of money, then potentially if things go wrong, then it's going to cost. And these sort of things are going to hopefully make businesses stand back and have a look at and make sure they're doing everything right. Our data is important and it needs to be protected. For violations relating to internal record keeping, data processor contracts, data security and breach notification, data protection officers, and data protection by design and default. So that's 2% of your annual worldwide turnover for the preceding financial year, or 10 million euros, whichever is greater, which is a substantial fine. And also the second group can be up to 4% of your annual worldwide turnover of the preceding financial year, or 20 million euros, whichever is the greater, for violations relating to breaches of the data protection principles, conditions for consent, data subjects' rights, and international data transfers. So the first one is about getting it right. The second one is about a data breach in itself. We also find that the powers of the NDPA has increased, that will enable them to impose fines, carry out audits, require businesses to provide information and obtain access to company premises to prove that you are doing what you said you have done when you pass this information over to the NDPA. Like I say, some serious fines there, and fines that every company, large or small, will understand that it is big. It definitely is something that are going to make people have a look at their security to make sure they're doing it right. One of the big things that GDPR is pushing across is awareness. You need to ensure that the decision makers or the key people in your business absolutely are aware of how the law is changing and what is going to be changing to do with the GDPR. You need to understand and appreciate the impact that it is likely to have on your business, and need to make sure that you've done everything you possibly can to ensure that when it goes live in May next year, that you've done all you possibly can to make sure that you're capable of dealing with the GDPR and everything is going according to plan. So looking at some of the things, consent. Consent will be much harder to obtain. The GDPR requires a very high standard of consent in all cases. You must give clear, affirmative action established, make sure that consent is freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous indication of the individual's agreement to their personal data being processed, such as a written statement. And that's the thing, quite often, like I say, you log onto a website, you give over your data, there's a tick box to say, do I give my consent or not? And it's almost now just a given. It's a bit like, for me, it's a bit like the whole EULA thing. If you want to install the product, you've got to tick the box to say, yes, I agree to your EULA. Well, what happens if I want to install the product, but I don't agree with all of the EULA, or I don't agree with some of the EULA, or I don't agree with the EULA at all? I don't think it's right, and I need to discuss it or work with somebody to have a look at it. Currently there's no option. You either tick it and use it, or you don't tick it and don't use it. And giving consent, I think, is very much a case of that. It needs to be clearly laid out that you've given consent, why you're giving consent, that you can withdraw consent, and you can also choose to be, like I say, forgotten about, or ask about how that data is going to be given. We also seen, or will be seeing, mandatory privacy by design and default. Nowadays it's all too easy to come up with a new process or a new way of doing something, and we need to make sure that when a business implement new technical measures and new organizational measures, that they look at the requirements of the GDPR and ensure that privacy is put in by design. So it's put in as the very base. So we're going to work together to ensure that privacy is working as well as what we want to do. It's not something that's bolted on at the end. It's not something that, right, okay, we've got it all up and running, we've done what we want to do, oh yeah, we now need to look at how we're going to protect this data. Businesses are now going to be able to show that they've looked at both the privacy and how they're going to do things, and that they've worked together and they've worked through them together, to ensure that the minimal amount of data is obtained, to make sure that we're not getting data that we don't actually use. I mean, I know certainly from my point of view, there's been times when I've looked at the type of data that's being asked for just for the job that I want to do on the internet or the website that I'm going to, and it's very much a case of, do I really need to do that? Do I really need to hand over those details or that information just to do that particular task? And hopefully the GDPR will assess those and try and sort out that, so only the right data is being asked for or taken at any one time. Mandatory Privacy Impact Assessments, or PIAs. Businesses will now be required to perform data protection PIAs or PIAs before carrying out any processing that uses any new technology, which means they need to make sure that any high-risk areas to data subjects are written about, knowledgeable, know what's going to happen, and make sure that that data is handled correctly. The ICO will publish a list of the kind of processing operations that require a PIA. And like I say, it's making sure that all of this information is written down, so that if any time the GDPR or anybody needs to access that information, that they can do that and it can be freely given without any obstacles or without any problems. Registering with the ICO. So instead of registering with the ICO, the GDPR will now require businesses to maintain detailed documentation, recording your entire processes. In addition, controllers or processors are required to appoint a data protection officer if the business requires it. If the business is a certain size and it warrants a data protection officer, then you may need to have to do one. You also need to keep records of or processing activities of any sort of data that is involved in the GDPR to ensure that those records are kept up to date. New obligations of data processors. So GDPR introduced direct compliance obligations now and financial penalties for processors. Like I say, currently before it was only data controllers that were viable for fines. Now it's the processors of data as well. Again, where we're going to see these huge fines, is 4% of annual worldwide turnover, and or 20 million euros, whichever is greater. And people that process data are going to be now just as at risk as the people that control data. Data breach notification. Again, this is going to be, this is going to be really big. All too often, we as the end user or the public find out that that their data has been stolen, or a data breach has happened, and the public are not notified about it. The GDPR now will require all businesses to notify the ICO of all data breaches without undue delay and where feasible within 72 hours. So it's not necessarily notifying the public, but certainly notifying the ICO. It would then obviously be looked at to see how it affects individuals, what sort of data is infected, and then from there on they can choose what they want to do about it. But it's about making sure that these are promptly notified about, so that there's no sort of time lapsing between that data has been stolen or the right measures are put in place and before the correct authorities know about it. So some of the user stuff. The right to be forgotten. Individuals have the right to request that business delete their personal data, and they need to ensure that it is deleted. We have seen instances before where the user can request that data has been deleted, but it doesn't actually delete the data, or it doesn't delete it correctly. But from now on, the user has the explicit right to be forgotten. If you want that data removed, then they can request that in writing, and it needs to be done in a timely manner, and it needs to be removed from any services. The end user, again, can ask for the right to object to profiling. So individuals have the right to object to their personal data being processed, which includes profiling. And as I said earlier, profiling is defined sort of broadly to include most forms of online tracking, behavior advertising, making it harder for business to use data for those activities. The factor profiling must be disclosed to the data subject, and a PIA is required. As I said earlier, PIAs are one of those new things that the GDPR are going to require businesses to do. Also the right to data portability. So now on, data subjects have the right to obtain a copy of their personal data. So they can request from you or from a business to have the data in how they describe it as a commonly used and machine readable format, and have the right to transmit that data to another controller, for example, an online service provider. And that's the thing, you know, it needs to be able to be read and viewed by a commonly used format, and they have the right for that. If they ask for that, then it has to be supplied in a timely manner. Data subject access request, businesses must reply within 1 month from date of receipt of the request and provide more information than was required under the Data Protection Directive. So they've set guidelines now to say that if somebody asks for information, then you know you have 1 month from the date of receipt of that request to you know, reply back with that information. You should also document the personal data that you hold. We need to know where it comes from. The GDPR needs to know where it comes from and who you share it with. And again, you may need to organize an information audit so that all that information is easily at hand. People can access it as and when they please. Communicating privacy information, you should review your current privacy notices and put a plan in place for making any necessary changes in time for GDPR implementation. It is definitely one of these situations where the information is going to be available and is available for companies to understand what's going to happen with the GDPR well in advance before it comes into legislation, before it becomes law. And need to make sure that procedures are in place to cover all the rights that individuals have. Individuals' rights are going to increase. You need to make sure that it's documented or, you know, noted how you're going to delete personal data, how you're going to provide data electronically, and in a format that people can understand. Absolutely needs to be that the average person can use and understand that data. Sending it in a format, you know, straight out of a database isn't going to be sufficient anymore. Subject access requests, update procedures and plan how to handle requests within the new timescale. So somebody asks for data, to make sure that you can retrieve the data, supply the data, and get it back to the end user or the requester within the time frames that have been laid down. Legal basis for processing personal data. Need to look at all the various types of data processing you carry out, identify legal basis for carrying it out, and document it. And there is an awful lot of documentation that needs to be kept for this type of data to ensure that at any time, if either the GDPR or the end user request that information, they can see that. You also need to look at the content to make sure that the content of the data you're receiving is data that you should be using, that you can use. You may need to record how you are seeking it, how you're obtaining it, how you're recording it, and you know, how long you intend to keep it and what you're going to do with it. It's one of those things, like I say, that is going to need a lot of attention to ensure that it's got right. If your business or the business deals with children in any way, there's going to be new measures in place to ensure that you can verify the individual's ages. And if they're underage, that parental or guardian consent is gathered before data processing activity. Again, it's one of those things that come against this. It's fairly easy these days for, you know, businesses to, or for individuals, you know, to gain access to accounts or websites or areas that they shouldn't do because they're underage. And there's going to be some new rules in place to ensure that you've done all you possibly can to, you know, to find out and to make sure that the age of the user is appropriate. Data breaches, of course, you need to make sure you've got right procedures in place to not only to detect them, to report them, and investigate personal data breaches. You know, data breaches are just a fact of the cyber industry, unfortunately. If you hold data, then, you know, you are a target. Whether you're a direct target or a target through opportunistic attack, you still are a target. And, you know, one of the things to come out of that is to ensure that you know, you do all you can to protect it. If it happens, that you do everything you can to make sure that you work with authorities to get all the right help and everything is done, and also that you've done something to make sure that it doesn't happen again, or you've done everything you can to ensure that you are protected for future. If needed, you may need to designate a data protection officer, and that's going to be down to company size, maybe company turnover, or the amount of data that you're holding. but someone will need to take responsibility for data protection compliance and assess where this role will sit within your organization structure. Again, it's one of those things that it's a difficult job. Data protection officer is going to be the job that's going to take the firing line if something goes wrong. And like I say, you can't always protect against it. You just, companies need to do all they can. They just need to prove that they've taken every perceivable measure to protect against a data breach, and have not been negligent in any way. And if you are dealing internationally, then you need to make sure that you are aware of how it affects you, to make sure that you report to and you deal with the right supervisory authorities that directly will handle the GDPR or the NDPA from within your organization. So I mean, there are lots and lots of changes that are happening. Some may affect you, some may not affect you. One of the ways, always when it comes down to data breaches, is what can you do? What extra stages can you do? What extra efforts can you put in to protect your data? And one of the ways that ESET can help you is with encryption. We use our encryption powered through Deslog, which gives us things like full disk encryption, file and folder encryption, USB encryption, email encryption, even mobile encryption. And although the ICO has published new guidance to say that, or the DPA does not specifically state that organizations must encrypt personal data, there have been many cases where having personal data encrypted correctly, working correctly, and I say working correctly, you often find that when encryption goes wrong, it invariably doesn't go wrong because the key strengths aren't good enough or the actual encryption routines aren't good enough. Quite often encryption, when it goes wrong because it was difficult to use, or the end user found it too complicated, or it didn't do what they thought it was going to do. And because of that, it's not used correctly. And just having encryption isn't sufficient. It needs to be used, and it needs to be proven that it was used if the data is lost or stolen. So certainly ESET can use you or can help you with Deslog and help you integrate that. One of our products, our Deslog product, uses things like shared keys to make it easier for everybody to just use the product without necessarily finding it difficult, or without it being complicated in any way, shape or form. So just to conclude, some of the pros and cons of GDPR, and it is a difficult one because people are going to be listening to this or reading information later on thinking it still doesn't, I don't know whether it affects me, or I still don't know, or it's still complicated, or I'm concerned that I'm not going to be able to do what I need to do. But the GDPR has the potential to introduce positive changes for many businesses. And of course, the thing is, the GDPR is there to help you as well. It's there to make sure that there's a single point that you can go to, and a single organization that you can say, I need help, or this has happened, and that's happened, and I need this sorted. Businesses may also benefit from the one-stop shop approach, and that's the approach where, like I say, it's a single organization. You haven't got to go around to multiple organizations to get the help. There's a single place to get that help. On the other hand, the GDPR is likely to require an awful lot of changes. Some companies will need to make massive changes across the EU, and when I say across the EU, it includes us as well. And then such changes may include redesigning systems, of course, that process personal data. I mean, there is an awful lot, and like I say, I have a white paper, or we have a white paper available. If anybody would like to download the white paper, it's of course free. You can get it from the FTP. It's going to be the same area that you can get this webinar from. You just need to send me an email. It's mark, M-A-R-K, @eset.co.uk. It is there, of course, if you want to use that one. And you can download this webinar, previous webinars, and the white paper. Now, I will open up for questions. Oh, I have some questions. There are some questions there that are pertinent, and some questions which are humorous. So I'm going to go with the pertinent ones. Can we have the presentation slides? Adams, yes, absolutely. Like I say, I have included them in the same folder. So you can have the slides, you can have the webinar, sorry, you can have the slides, you can have the webinar, and you can have the white paper all downloaded from that. Hi Mark, where do we find the requirements for small business to have a data protection officer? Like I say, that will come from the GDPR. I mean, the GDPR actual paper is huge. Now what we've done is we've done a concise white paper now, which you can download and use. And as we get closer, we're going to release other bits of information that are going to help people do this. The thing is, it's one of these things that people are going to need to work towards. Who are the GDPR fines paid to, and does the end user receive reimbursement for any potential leak of their private data? That would be really nice, Timothy, and that would be great if it happened, but sadly it doesn't. Unfortunately, I am not privy to where those GDPR fines go to, and there is certainly no reimbursement for the people that are involved in the data leak, unfortunately. What about anonymized results, such as the collection of data on the underground about Wi-Fi? Well, again, things like that. If they are retrieving information that can be directly related to you, then they will abide by everything that we've talked about today. They will need to make sure that they enable you to ask about the information and can retrieve the information. Are there any definitive definition of what is personal data? Yes, Keith, there is. And if you go onto ICO's webpage, they have I say a clear definitive of what's personal data. There is a clear definitive of what they determine as personal and what they determine as private data. Literally just go to the ICO webpage and you can see that. Does this also cover information such as a contractor receiving drawings for a building as well? Interesting one of that. Because it would need to be related, the format that you're receiving it from and how it relates, and can it be tagged back to the person it come from. So if there's personal data on those drawings, then technically that could potentially fall under the Data Protection Act. But again, as we move forward, we're going to see more information about how specifically it's going to affect people, what it's going to affect, and whether it affects you. Like I say, you can email me, mark@eset.co.uk, to get a copy of the webinar, a copy of the white paper, and a copy of these slides. Please, keep an eye out on the mailing list for any more information that comes along. I will update the presentations and try and offer any more advice I possibly can. And for me, that's what it is. It's trying to make your life a little bit easier, trying to enable you to, make the right decisions and get it right in the long run. Obviously, we have no correlation or direct correspondence with GDPR or anybody that affects that. All I want to do is just try and hopefully, even if I make you go away thinking, I have no idea what he was on about, I need to go and have a look at it. If you do that, then I've achieved my goal. If you go away and you said, right, that's going to affect me, I've achieved my goal. So I've done hopefully what I wanted to do today. Like I say, mark@eset.co.uk. And again, if you've got any questions, then by all means, email me at that email address. Anyway, thank you all very much for attending. Have a great rest of the day, and please look out for any future webinars. You are more than welcome to join. Anyway, thank you very much. Have a great day.